Welcome to the War on the Rocks podcast, covering strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Nicholas Danforth. I'm an editor with War on the Rocks, and I'm delighted to be here today in Tokyo, sitting down with two of Japan's leading national security experts. I'm joined by Satoru Mori, professor at Keio University, where he also is the deputy director of the Keio Center for Strategy. He's also senior fellow at Nakasone Institute and a former official at the Foreign Ministry. I'm also joined by Yasu Izumikawa, professor at the School of Politics, Economics, and Communication at Aoyama Gakuin University. Thank you both for joining me this morning.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So we're going to cover, honestly, as much as possible in the half an hour or so we have. But I wanted to start by asking you to give us and our listeners a brief overview of what, going on, I guess, almost a year on, the impact of last December's national defense strategy has been.
This is Satoru Mori. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be able to be on this podcast. With regard to Japan's national defense strategy, I think it came out together with the national security strategy, which is an overarching strategy that covers not only defense, but also economic and other means to achieve national security. I think in terms of implementation, we're at the early stages. So one of the major tasks for the Japan Self-Defense Force right now is to sort of improve its readiness. One of the major shortfalls in Japan Self-Defense Force is that it's short in parts and also in terms of operational tempo. And there has been reporting saying that the level of operations of the Japan Self-Defense Force is something like 50% instead of 70 or 80%. The number of, for example, missile defense interceptors is something like 60% of what is required. And there are oftentimes many cases where the Japan Self-Defense Force needs to take off parts from one weapon system and put it onto another weapon system. And I think maybe roughly 70 to 80% of Japan Self-Defense Force facilities are not hardened. And so these are some areas that require heavy investment. And I think over the next 5 years, this is going to be a major target, some of the major tasks for the Ministry of Defense as well as the Japan Self-Defense Force to work on. And they are also working on new capabilities. They're looking
right. Let me ask you about those as well.
Right, yeah. And over the next 5 to 10 years, they have 5-year, 10-year benchmarks. And some of, new capabilities that stand out are counter-strike capabilities and active cyber defense capabilities. And these are new capabilities that are going to be introduced. And
well, let me ask about the counter-strike capabilities in particular, because that's something people in Washington have been very eager to know more about.
Counter-strike capability is designed to respond to foreign aggression, and it is based on the principle of self-defense. And essentially, Japan is going to acquire long-range precision strike capabilities. And this is going to include, on the hardware side, for example, 400 Tomahawks. This was planned to be initially deployed by 2026, but they moved it up to 2025 right now. So that's going to be deployed soon, within the next couple of years. And Japan is also developing what they call the Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles. These will be used to counter threats coming overseas. And so these are new capabilities that Japan is going to be using. And this came out as a result of this notion that China's growing theater range conventional missile capability is becoming increasingly difficult to counter by purely defensive means, meaning missile defense systems. And therefore, there is this urgent need for Japan to take additional measures to have these. And counter-strike capabilities, based on my understanding, is that they will focus more on fixed targets because, obviously striking moving targets is a very high, it requires a wide range of capabilities. So sort of the so-called strike packages, including, electromagnetic planes and so forth. And so Japan is probably looking at striking fixed targets, and that would enable U.S. forces to focus more on mobile targets. So that's the basic, I think, concept behind this new capability acquisition, yeah.
Yasu, do you want to jump in here?
Since Satoru sort of focused on the technical side of the issue, I would like to talk about more of a political and broader sort of perspectives regarding the change in Japanese security policy. One is the changing domestic dynamics regarding the public attitude toward the issue of defense. Japan is known for being a pacifist or anti-militaristic for a long time, especially since World War II. And in my opinion, and this is something that I've written in my past, is that it's a little bit over-exaggerated. Japan's policy have been more pragmatic than usually regarded. But especially since last December, what's interesting is that there were really weak public sort of reaction to it, except that the issue of who's going to pay for the increased defense budget. It seems to me that, Japanese people are really sort of, fine with the idea that we need more sort of hardwares and hard capabilities to deal with the increasing threats that the Satoru described. So that's one issue. And the other thing that I'd like to point out is that the strategic change actually is reflected in a way that Japanese government is taking more proactive approaches, and Japanese national security used to be regarded as, the principle of Japanese defense is basically the defensive defense in Japanese, senshu boei. Especially, this is something that is becoming more evident in the cyber issues. That I've heard that in the past, even in the cyber area, Japan's sort of way of cyber defense was restricted because of that principle, right? But now the strategic document actually makes it clear that even in all domains, Japan needs to take a more proactive approach. And that certainly is reflected in the way in which defense officials in the government are actually dealing with various issues like, the conventional and cyber issues.
If I may jump in just maybe 2 points. The first point regarding the public's sort of notion of how much defense investment we need. I think the impact of the Ukraine aggression against, Russian aggression against Ukraine had a major impact. There was already a heightening sense of sort of security challenge coming from China before February 2022. But I think Russian aggression against Ukraine had a huge impact on not only the Japanese public, but also on the government as well. So there is this punchline in the national security saying that something similar to the Ukraine situation could happen in the Indo-Pacific. And so that has been a major impetus. I also wanted to just add one point about the implementation, which is about the budget.
Yes.
And many people often ask whether it's fundable or not. And
I think we've had articles in War on the Rocks asking, in fact, if it's fundable. So
yes. There are multiple sources of funding, and some of them come from reallocation of budget resources and reform of national spending. But one of the political heavy lifting that is going to be required is the tax increase. And Prime Minister Kishida postponed the decision to 2025, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's not going to come up for a while. But I think if you even look at the whole increase of this defense budget, this is 43 trillion yen over the next 5 years. We spent 70-some trillion yen in a single year for COVID. So the amount is not insurmountable, I don't think. It's about political will. And when we talk about taxes, I think the current understanding is that there are corporate tax and also tobacco tax are going to be some of the sources, right?
Okay.
But there is this argument against increasing the corporate tax because we face inflation. So if they actually raise the corporate tax, then it's going to dissuade companies from raising wages. And this is not going to be good, politically speaking. And therefore, there are some members of the Diet who are opposed to this idea. But we'll have to see, whether it's actually implementable or not depends on the Prime Minister's political capital. So, and we'll have to see, who's going to be the Prime Minister in 2025 and whether he'll have enough political capital to push this through.
So I guess what you're saying, not surprisingly, is that to the extent there's resistance amongst the public, it's not on some broader ideological stance about pacifism, but it's pocketbook issues. It's about the payment.
Yeah, exactly. I think that Japanese politics used to be characterized by sort of the competition between the right and left, with the left a little bit more advantageous over the right. And for the last several years, I think things have really changed and it's still changing. Right now, the people in the middle tend to be tilted toward the right.
On national defense, how does the left-right spectrum break down?
Is really having hard time coming up with some sort of viable strategy to challenge against the moderate right and the nationalist sort of defense positions. They used to take neutrality and they used to oppose the U.S.-Japan security partnership. But more than 80% of the Japanese people basically supports the U.S.-Japan security relations. So, it's really difficult. So, one of the reasons why the left is becoming really weaker is not just that, they are really weak on domestic issues, but also the international issues.
Let me take a step back then. As you mentioned with cyber, you mentioned with counter-strike missile capabilities. At this current point in time, how do people actually understand the difference between what is defensive and what is offensive?
I think the traditional distinction between offensive and defensive is Japan's capability whether Japan is capable of striking the opponent's territory or not. And that kind of capability were not discussed actually in the national security debate. And that came along with this counter-strike and active cyber defense, because this is about striking in the enemy's territory. And with regard to cyber, it's going to be about penetration into the attacker's servers and systems and so forth. So I think that was quite new. And yet, what is striking is that there was not significant backlash from the public about going across this line. And I think that's a reflection of the Japanese public's appreciation of the looming security challenge that's coming from not only China but also North Korea and Russia.
Yeah, I completely agree with Satoru. The perception of threat perception regarding China played a huge role in the change in the way in which Japanese people react to those, national security issues. And the Japanese government used to have a very strict sort of guideline regarding what kind of weapon systems that they are able to sort of acquire under the present Japanese constitution. They used to say that we cannot really procure the aircraft carrier. We cannot procure the long-range missiles because that's exactly the tools to attack the targets, and that's not the defensive defense. Somehow, those restrictions sort of fade away, and the ordinary people really don't pay attention to these issues, and the fact that their reaction is muted really shows that they just take it for granted in a way.
Hi everybody, Aaron Stein here, and I just wanted to take a minute from Nick's conversation to tell you about War on the Rocks Platinum, which is our membership program. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you sign up today at warontherocks.com/membership, you'll gain access to a whole bunch of cool things, like Thinking the Unthinkable, a podcast with Ankit Panda discussing the third nuclear age, and of course the Russia Contingency with Michael Kaufman, our twice-monthly podcast focused on the niche from the Russian military to the war in Ukraine. We also have a podcast I host, and Nick also hosts, called The Insider, where we go into depth about articles published on the War on the Rocks website, as well as Unspent Rounds, which is interesting conversations with interesting people. And we have a bunch, and I'm talking about a lot of newsletters, from Rewind and Reconnoiter to The Adversarial, which is a succinct analysis of America's adversaries, to In Brief, which is quick, up-to-date analysis of regional events, and a couple more that are coming online in winter 2023. So I'd like to encourage you to head on over to warontherocks.com/membership, sign up today, and with that, back to Nick.
Then let me ask you the big question that a lot of people in DC are also very curious about. How would all of these factors come together? How would they play out in a Taiwan scenario? And, if you can tell us what exactly you think the Japanese government would do in that situation, we'd love to hear it. If that's too difficult of a prediction to make, give us a sense of how to think about the choices that Tokyo would face.
I was going to actually talk about the Taiwan issue in Japanese politics.
Fantastic.
because that's certainly the major challenge. Compared with what it was like 10 or 15 years ago, I think the government is more likely to be able to push through the kind of policies that they would love to, meaning that they are less constrained by the Japanese public sort of hesitance in a way.
And spell out what you think those policies would be, just
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, this is a kind of minimum thing that that Japanese government need to do is to allow U.S. bases to be used, as effectively as possible. But not only that, the question is how quickly that the self-defense force will be able to sort of conducts the operations to support and, if necessary, take active roles in dissuading and pushing back the Chinese sort of attacks against Taiwan. But, that's something that, Japanese public still don't appreciate. I mean, they don't really understand that the Japanese territory can be attacked by Chinese missile capabilities. And this is where the Japanese government has not done enough job of educating. And in a way, I mean, I understand that this is really touchy political and strategic issues for politicians to push through. But, sooner or later, I mean, the Japanese government and Japanese politicians need to gradually sort of soften the Japanese people's sort of understanding or, possible sort of resistance to the idea that, there's a risk involved,
Maybe I should talk about how the government could potentially respond to a Taiwan contingency. And
please.
Yes, and also the public's reaction, potential public reaction. With regard to the government side, I think Yasu correctly pointed out, I fully agree with him that, basically the two lines of effort will be about supporting U.S. operations to defend Taiwan, including the use of bases and allowing U.S. forces to come through and surge in the area. And also the second line would be for Japan to defend its own. And this is going to be very important. And, the whole reason behind this defense buildup, GDP 2%, is to enable Japan. Traditionally, the defense of Japan, in the narrow context of defense of Japan, we used to talk about the American spear and the Japanese shield. The official documents really do not lay this out. But based on my conversations with senior government officials who were involved in this strategic document planning, the final goal is to allow Japan to assume more of the spear role, the offensive role, to defend itself, and enable the United States to focus more on defense of Taiwan. So what's happening is going to be this functional division of labor shifting to a theater division of labor. And this is going to be one of the ideal outcomes or end state of the Japan-US alliance, I think. And this is if these plans go ahead as planned in the next 5 to 10 years. So and so that's one of the images that Japanese government is probably having in their mind when they talk about responding to a Taiwan contingency. One of the things that worry me is that I think the Japanese government and the U.S. government will respond firmly, and they will probably have plans to respond to the various types of contingencies, ranging from blockade to full-scale invasion and so forth. But I worry whether the public will come on board. Because it's going to involve substantial risk. I mean, this is about intervening in the Taiwan situation when China is threatening retaliation, right? And they're certainly going to retaliate or initiate an attack against the Japanese homeland at the initial stages. But there are two potential reactions from the Japanese public. I mean, fear and anger. And I'm not quite sure which of these two will prevail in the Japanese public, because if the Japanese public believe that Taiwan security is divisible from Japanese security, they can fall prey to Chinese information operations saying, why do you have to die for Taiwan? If you stay out of this conflict, we can end this conflict very soon, and we can limit casualties and damages. And if people believe that Taiwan security is separate from Japanese security, they'll say, yeah, why not? Why do we have to suffer for this? And so I think there needs to be a fundamental reframing of this Taiwan situation. What I mean by that is we should not be focusing solely on the fallout from the armed conflict over Taiwan, because this is about how many people will die, what kind of economic damage will sustain from this conflict. But think about what's going to happen to Japan's future if China controls Taiwan. And if that happens, it's very likely that the PLA will have free access to the Pacific Ocean. U.S. force posture will have to dramatically change and probably undermine U.S. capability to defend Japan. And Japan's going to turn into a sort of a strategic enclave in the Western Pacific, probably South Korea as well. And we will probably vehemently oppose forceful unification of Taiwan, which means that China will apply every possible pressure on Japan to bend Japanese political will so that Japan will accept Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. And this is basically Chinese regional hegemony. Japan's going to have to face these coercion and pressure constantly from China. And if we think in those terms, you begin to think, what is at stake in this situation? And if people understand that Taiwan contingency or Taiwan issue is not about only Taiwan, but it's about Japan's future, then they begin to sort of form the public resolve to resist aggression and think about, accepting risks and costs in this situation. So that's the kind of public debate I think needs to take place. And I fully agree with Yasu's point about, the public's need to, kind of develop these kind of understanding from now on.
Taiwan contingency can refer to a lot of different things. It can be a euphemism for an unprovoked Chinese attack on Taiwan, or it can be other kinds of escalation. In the mind of the Japanese public, how much do you think it matters what the road to war would be? Is there a sense that certain kinds of unprovoked attacks would be more likely to elicit anger, whereas if it was seen as Taiwan pushing too hard for independence, the United States being provocative, that would change the way the public understood things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it does matter to a certain extent. And you probably know that there are subtle differences between the Japanese and the American governments regarding how to deal with this sort of one China policy issues. And I mean, Japan is slightly more careful than Washington in basically sort of Japan is more forthcoming, I would say, to say that, Taiwan is a part of China and we don't defend sort of, Taiwan's independence kind of thing. And that's necessary. I was actually in Taiwan just about 1 month ago, I think. And I realized that even the people in Taiwan are really sensitive about the, U.S. positions regarding Taiwan and China. And, they, of course, appreciate the more willingness on the part of the U.S. to come to the defense of Taiwan if something happens. But at the same time, when they see sort of overreacting or sort of overly sort of provoking the China, which intensified the tensions between Taiwan and China, then, the people in Taiwan feel like, well, maybe it's too much, right? So, I mean, you can basically say the same thing about Japanese people. And so, I mean, striking the balance between sufficiently sort of committed and overly provoking China. I mean, that's a difficult thing to do. Politically, but that's something that is required, I think.
I also agree with, I want to echo Yasu-san's point. Generally speaking, one of my observations is that I think when we enacted the security legislation back in 2015, there were some lingering sentiment thinking that increasing defense capability is somehow going to turn Japan into an aggressive power. And therefore, there were some hesitant voices saying, not only procedural-wise, but also on the substantively speaking, Japan having more military power is going to actually increase tension in the region, therefore. But as a result of this, unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine, I think people began to realize that these things could happen. Even if you don't act, the revisionist power can use force to change the status quo. And as a result, I think there's more understanding for deterrence. And for Japan to accept deterrence is like, to some extent, getting out from the historical lesson of World War II. The reason behind one of the fundamental elements of Japan's pacifism, post-war pacifism, was that because we had military power, we turned into an aggressive state and a military state, and therefore engaged in aggression. So having military power is not good. It's going to end up in a bad situation. But that, I think, sort of historical, I wouldn't say the lesson has been forgotten. It's not that. But I think there's been a more sophistication of the security environment, understanding the meaning of deterrence. And people want peace, and therefore they now support deterrence, building up defense capabilities. And that's, I think, what's been happening over the past 2 or 3 years. Yeah.
Let me turn to asking about the U.S.-Japanese alliance on a more day-to-day basis. What's working well? What needs improvement?
I'm not really informed of those daily sort of operational, side of the relationship. But, the things that I've heard from the people in the defense is that, well, first of all, the issue of contingency. We talked about just Taiwan, and, what really, Japan will be able to do and how fast and, those kind of issues, of course, need to be addressed. And we talked about cyber, but the space issue, of course, is another area that Japan really need to sort of build and catch up with what's going on, especially because the assets in the space have become more important and more vulnerable these days, unfortunately. And I don't think that's the area that Japan has done a good job of catching up. Another thing that I hear a lot from the people who are actually working in the self-defense forces, that they really need the basic stuff to be sort of improved, like the storage for the ammunitions and production capabilities of producing those kind of basic war materials. This is something that that's evident in Europe too right now, but it's too late. When something happens and we try to do things, right? So last December's decision to boost the, Japanese national security is really good opportunity to sort of look at those basics, from the beginning and just started to improve those on the ground kind of things. Satoru talked about the hardening the bases and other stuff, and that's another thing too we need to do. But those basic things have been kind of left out because defense has been under budgeted for such a long time. So we need a lot of works, I think, to do.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on Yasu's point about military construction. I think Japan adopted this new scheme called Official Security Assistance. Traditionally, Japan's Official Development Assistance, which is the foreign assistance program, was governed by this principle of non-military. And now they've established this new scheme that would enable the Japanese government to provide not only equipment, but also infrastructure investment for foreign militaries. And I think, personally, this is my just own opinion, but I think there is much room for Japan and the United States to think about a region-wide military construction program and, investing in a very more coordinated and efficient manner to enable not only U.S. forces, distributed force posture, but also Japan to, base access in times of contingency. Now, obviously, regions will be limited, but I think Philippines is one country that they're now focusing on. So that's one thing that Japan and the United States could potentially work on. Interoperability for missiles, ammunitions, and so forth is a major issue. Now that you have the Hamas-Israeli conflict and also Ukraine still continuing, I think we have to prepare for a sort of three-theater scenario and have sufficient production bases, not only in the United States, but also in Europe and Japan. So this is going to be a sort of an inter-ally defense production network that's probably going to be needed. And to achieve that, I think Japan, one of the hallmarks that Japan needs to do is information security. I think this is going to be a major issue for Japan over the next year or so. And one of them is obviously security clearance, but this is more sort of a specific issue. But I think Japan needs to build up the trust vis-a-vis not only the US, but also other US allies in the NATO countries, that Japan has this sufficient information security to enable not only technology, but also data sharing of various domains. That's a second issue probably. And thirdly, they're now working on a command and control modernization. And so Japan is going to stand up its permanent joint headquarters by March 2025. And the US is going to set up its joint forces headquarters under the Indo-Pacific Command, which supposedly will be the counterpart to this new PJHQ. And so experts are debating about, what form and shape this should take and where it should be located and so forth. So that's a major issue that needs to be worked on, I think. And lastly, talking with the Taiwanese authorities is one of the very difficult issues, I think. Politically speaking, we can't do it. So there's no interaction at the official level between Japan and Taiwan. And I think there's more deeper engagement between the US and Taiwan. So non-official, completely under the surface consultation somewhere in the United States among US, Japan, Taiwan, and also Australia is something that is probably badly needed. We can't start talking with the Taiwanese after there's a crisis or after a conflict breaks out, and there needs to be some sort of consultation. But we have to do it unofficially, I think, and so that's one of the challenges. Maybe have a sort of a track to conference and have government officials observe that kind of conference and do it at a completely disclosed location in an unofficial setting is probably something that we have to think about when we talk about well-coordinated response to a Taiwan crisis and contingency.
So you brought up two things that I want to follow up on very briefly, and then I'm afraid we'll be out of time. Yasu, since I know you've written about this, Japan's bilateral relationships with other U.S. allies across the Indo-Pacific.
In my writing, I basically explained the way in which the alliance system in this region was kind of networked in a way. So in the past, when, for example, like South Korea had a strong relationship with the United States, then they felt like less incentives to coordinate security policy with Japan and things like that. So in a way, I mean, the relationship between South Korea and the United States was negatively sort of linked to the U.S.-Japan relations. So that used to be the kind of way, but for good or bad, because of the increasing Chinese capabilities and threats coming from there, the more security is needed now. So, Japan and the other allies in the region recognize that now they don't have a luxury of sort of playing politics, basically, among those, the so-called U.S. sort of spokes allies in the region. So that's something that, that need to be done. Satoru talked about the Australia-Japan relations. That's one of the really promising area. And a lot has happened for the last 2 decades or so, and there's going to be more.
Regarding security cooperation among U.S. allies, this lattice work, so to speak, I think Japan, U.S., and Australia having a sort of a 2+2+2 to engage in a sort of a federated defense approach is something that is badly needed. I think the 3 countries will be the front line for deterring China. And, this A2AD threat ring is going to get larger and probably more denser in the years to come. So those 3 countries probably need to cooperate very heavily, not in terms of coordination, command and control, of co-development of new capabilities, and also force posture. And so those 3 pillars, I think, should be much more needs to be well coordinated. Also, I think we need countries like UK to get into, through AUKUS, into this capability development domain. I think there are certain NATO countries that we can tap into. We're doing this next generation fighter program with the UK and the Italians. And this is a sort of a new effort that's probably Japan's interested in pursuing. US is obviously going to be the primary ally through which we're going to develop our capabilities, but we're going to increasingly take a sort of a multi-partnership approach in the capability development.
One very final question before we run out of time. There's been a running debate in the United States about how the Ukraine war is either distracting or not distracting the United States from the Indo-Pacific. Now we have a new war going on in the Middle East. What does that debate look like from here?
Before the problem flared up in the Middle East, I mean, there was a general sort of attitude that, within Japan, as far as I know, there was not strong voice, worrying about the U.S. capability to do something in Taiwan while dealing with the issues in Ukraine. Right now, there are already 2 conflicts going on in the other regions, and if another comes up in this region, that could be a challenge. So that worries me personally, but I haven't talked to many other people on this issue. But this is something that now we are facing the new situation. So it's really difficult to say, to be honest. But before, there was not strong sense of sort of worry regarding the U.S. capability. Actually, we're worried more about the U.S. domestic politics and what's going to go, what's going on in there. So that's going to be another huge issue that we need to pay attention to.
Picking up on Yasu's point, that with regard to U.S., I think the so-called strategic trade-off situation is one issue, and the other one is how the U.S. presidential election is going to unfold next year. And so, with regard to the former, I think resource-wise, I think if Hezbollah starts attacking Israel in a massive scale and Iran gets involved, I think that's going to create a sort of an ammunition, missile issue, like 155 millimeter howitzers, Patriot system. Those are probably high demand items in three theaters, and not necessarily in the Asian theater. I think that's more to do with the Korean Peninsula, the howitzers, but it could potentially have impact. So it's going to depend on how the conflict in the Middle East is going to unfold and whether U.S. as well as other countries will be able to provide the necessary military material to dealing with the situation. Strategic attention of the U.S. leadership could be sort of trisected into the three regions. How is China or North Korea going to perceive that? Is a sort of a question that looms in our mind. And in terms of deterrence, those are resource and strategic attention and political resolve to sort of deal with the three areas is going to be much tougher on the United States. That's one issue. Second issue is I'm supportive of the Biden administration's current approach to dealing with the conflict. I mean, providing support to Israel is probably necessary to, exercise influence on the Israeli government and so forth. And, trying to contain the conflict in the region is the right way to go. But at the same time, I think there are so-called global South countries that criticize this. Now, this is going to happen, whatever approach we take. But countries like South Africa, Indonesia, and Malaysia have criticized, because they criticize Hamas, but they also say that this is a result of Israeli policy towards Palestine and so forth. So U.S. supporting Israel, they criticize, and that's sort of having a negative effect on. And Japan actually also designated Hamas as a sort of a terrorist organization, and we support Israel. We say that Israel has the right to defend its own countries, right, based on international law. So we are on the same page as the United States, but we are subjected to this kind of criticism from countries that have different value systems. So there, I think, diplomatically speaking, our influence over those countries are, relatively speaking, receding as a result of pursuing our policy. So that's having an impact. And lastly, I just wonder, how the U.S. threat perception is going to change. It used to be China and then China-Russia, and now you have Iran coming back in picture. And I also worry that, between September and October, North Korea apparently shipped 1,000 containers worth of military material to Russia, right? The big question is, what is Russia providing to North Korea in return? And if it's like military satellite technology, high-end missile technology, or even submarine technology, that's going to have a major impact on the destabilizing impact on the Northeast Asia region. And so we have, you come back to this Obama administration, four actors, right? Or maybe even five. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and terrorist organization. But their level of security challenge is elevated as a result of Russia's giving out these high-end military technology, and they have cooperation with Iran as well, right? Russia. So it's an even more difficult situation. Even we have the same security challenges. That's going to pose a major constraint and pressure on the United States, and that means that Japan's going to have to work more and play a larger role, I think, in the Pacific region to sustain and maintain deterrence.
Thank you both for sitting down to talk to me about all of these challenges. Look forward to having you back on the War on the Rocks podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.